and we're live.
Hi, hello and welcome everyone to the Riot Science Club. I'm Milan. I'm joined with Lorenz and Luisa today. We're from the Rotterdam side of the Riot Club, and we're happy you could all join us today for the seminar on intersectionality, critical theories and methods in psychological science. Before we start, for all newcomers, we'll give some brief information about us, the Riot Science Club, who are organizing the seminar. So the Riot Science Club is a grassroots initiative. It hosts weekly seminars that aim to raise awareness and provide training in reproducible, interpretable, open, transparent science. So that's our acronym, RIOTS. All our events are entirely free, open to anyone with an internet connection. If you cannot make a particular event or would like to keep track of upcoming events, and here you can see our calendar on the right. We have a lot of exciting upcoming seminars that you can join. Then please check out our website, YouTube channels, social media accounts. Lorenzo should be sharing those now in the Q&A chat. Because we're open sciencers, we also have a OSF page, so you'll see links for the Rotterdam website and Twitter, and you can learn more about our local events and future seminars there. So a tiny bit of housekeeping before we get started. You will have noticed that we host our events on the Microsoft Teams platform. That generates a publicly accessible link, so anyone can join. Please feel free to share the link with anyone publicly. Also, Live Events is a one-way streaming platform. You can ask your questions in the Q&A message board, which will be moderated by myself and Lorenz and Luisa. Please keep your questions, comments relevant and respectful. And finally, if you join late, don't worry at all. You can pause, rewind, fast forward, or even enable the auto subtitling feature that Live Events does for us. Okay, now we can get to our main event and speaker with that out of the way. So Annalisa Myer, she's a PhD student at the Graduate Center at CUNY. She studies interracial interactions, intersectionality, and perceptions of biracial people. So I'll let her introduce her topic herself. Suffice to say, today we'll be talking about parts of science that rarely, if ever, get discussed in a typical graduate trajectory. We hope you enjoyed the talk. Annalisa, we're happy to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Hello, am I live?
Just a second, can you please share your screen?
Okay.
Okay, and now you're live.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lorenza, for having me here and making sure my screen is shared properly. I'm excited to be here with everyone. My name is Annalisa Myer. I'm a basic and applied social psychology PhD student at the Graduate Center here in New York. And here at the Graduate Center, we consider ourselves a leader in graduate education and social justice. Today, I'm excited to share with you all my ongoing work on intersectionality, which I think has the potential to really enhance and enrich psychological science and science broadly. So I really appreciate you for being here today. But before we begin, I like to orient my audience by providing a richer context on who I am and what I do. So a little bit more about me and my science approach, if you will. In particular, when we're talking about critical theories and methods such as intersectionality, I think it's valuable to describe my science approach and the experiences that inspired me to study intersectionality. So I use in my research a comprehensive, intersectional, and accessible science approach to psychological science in particular. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how that is informed by my activism and leadership. But first, I want to describe a little bit about what a comprehensive, intersectional, and accessible science approach might mean. By that, I mean one that promotes globalization and diversity, research integrity and applicability, collaboration across fields and disciplines, and holistic theory building. By that, I mean, I want to capture people's experiences broadly, but also people frequently underrepresented within our research. I want to create a psychological science that is accountable to others, that is scientifically sound, that speaks to other areas of psychology or the sciences, that enhances rather than limits our understanding of human behavior, and of course, to speak to intersectionality broadly, to address socio-political context and history with a focus on power, which I'll get into more today. Notably, as I mentioned before, this approach was informed by and is responsive to my activism and leadership. Prior to graduate school, I was an activist and a student leader. And it was in my work with Tarana Burke on the Me Too movement that I was first introduced to the concept of intersectionality. So this story is really to orient you to my inspiration again as to how I kind of got involved learning about intersectionality. For those of you who don't know who she is, I'm very pleased to provide context on Tarana Burke. So she's an American activist from the Bronx in New York, and she started the Me Too movement to raise awareness of the pervasiveness of sexual abuse and assault in society. The phrase, quote, Me Too, developed into a broader movement following the popularization of the hashtag Me Too on Twitter after the Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse allegations, and since then has been used to develop solidarity among survivors globally, so not just within the US. This movement was also happening around the same time I was in college, not to age myself too much, and gained popularity around the same time as the 2019 documentary television series Surviving R. Kelly, which detailed the numerous sexual abuse allegations against American singer Robert R. Kelly. The story focused on his victims, which were Black women and girls, and their stories have stuck with me ever since. Their stories, I believe, are really formative to the way I approach my science, particularly on intersectionality and my prioritization of Black women and girls in my research. This is intentional, both to highlight the roots of Black feminist history and activism that are central to intersectionality, which I will discuss later on, but also to raise awareness about the many Black women and girls who are so quickly erased from our attention, yet frequently sit at the margins of multiple axes of oppression, including racism and sexism, which again, I will touch on today. I hope you will bring your own experiences and stories to the discussion today. And now I want to turn your attention to intersectionality, which is why we are gathered here today. But first, I would like to recognize that some of you in the audience might already be familiar with intersectionality, maybe as a critical theory or praxis, and I commend you for your awareness. Others, I'm sure, might be new to the concept and eager to learn. I also commend you for showing up today. Now, to make sure everyone is on the same page, I'd like to define what intersectionality is, and as an added bonus, what it isn't or what it sometimes is conflated with, particularly within academic context. So by definition, if you look up what intersectionality is, you might stumble across this. So intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. To me, I believe it describes the ways in which systems of inequality, quote, intersect to create different outcomes for different people. And these systems of inequality are frequently shaped by identities such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, class, and so forth. According to the Intersectionality Training Institute, actually, which was founded by Dr. Lisa Boleg, intersectionality can also be defined as one, a field of study 2, an analytical strategy, and 3, a critical praxis. And by that I meaning to be applied to social justice efforts or alternatively implemented to inspire social change. The Institute also reminds us that intersectionality is foremost about an attention to power, which I mentioned earlier, and is rooted in Black feminist history and activism. So as an example, the Combahee River Collective, which is frequently cited as an application of intersectionality. This is a US Black feminist lesbian organization that was created in the 1970s. And they were founded to uniquely fill the needs of Black women and lesbians who were otherwise excluded from the feminist movement and the civil rights movement happening in the US at the time. So while one was dominated by white women, the feminist movement, the other was largely dominated by Black men, the civil rights movement. And to keep this in mind, I want you to consider this as we continue our discussion. Since then, intersectionality has been applied to a variety of academic disciplines, including psychological science, as a critical, innovative, and transformative tool for analysis and praxis. So again, what I would refer to as scalable social change. So actually being implemented within social justice pursuits or projects. In academic circles, you might also hear people conflate intersectionality with the experience of possessing multiple marginalized identities. However, intersectionality is not just about identities. So again, to think back to the Intersectionality Training Institute, intersectionality is not just about identities, not even multiple ones. Instead, intersectionality centers power and the effects of interlocking oppression and discrimination, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, and more, to really understand the drivers of discrimination and privilege. Conflating intersectionality, I would argue, with anything other than the examination of power is gross negligence and seemingly a trap that academics frequently fall into. So I would caution you away from doing this. If you don't already know, the term was originally coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. However, I would argue that Crenshaw was writing about these concepts long before the term was formally established or even talked about within academic circles. So to think back to the Combahee River Collective, these are ideas that people were already thinking about and traces long before the collective. Crenshaw is also widely recognized as an American civil rights advocate and a leading scholar of critical race theory. She's also a professor at the UCLA School of Law and here in New York City, the Columbia Law School. Her article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics, is frequently noted for advancing work on intersectionality and Black women. In the article, Crenshaw describes a 1976 court case against General Motors. General Motors, if you don't know, is a common car company in the US, and I also might imagine globally. But basically, the plaintiffs alleged that the company's hiring practices specifically discriminated against Black women, and that the discrimination they faced could not be described as either racial discrimination or sex discrimination alone. The courts weighed the allegations of race and sex discrimination separately, finding that the employment of Black male factory workers disproved racial discrimination, and the employment of white female office workers disproved sex discrimination. However, the court declined to consider compound discrimination, so both the racial and sexual discrimination that Black women face, and dismissed the case. Does that sound familiar? The frustrations are very similar to the Kamhi River Collective I mentioned earlier. The case is also frequently cited in Crenshaw's writing, interviews, and lectures to demonstrate the consequences of failing to consider intersectionality or intersectional systems of oppression and discrimination. It's also a tangible example of how we frequently fail Black women and girls to accurately highlight and portray their experiences and the role power plays. From a psychological perspective, right, so I am a social psychology PhD student. Her work and the work of many Black feminist scholars has been used to catalyze health equity, advance critical white studies, and many other disciplines within psychology specifically. And a few scholars within our discipline have engaged with her work to advance psychology, especially social psychology, which I want to touch on very briefly. Take, for instance, psychologists. I'd think of Elizabeth Cole, Isis Settles, Valerie Purdie Greenaway, and my beloved mentor, Kira Hudson. Or you might have heard concepts such as intersectional invisibility, double jeopardy, gendered prejudice, and ethnic prominence, to name a few. This is, of course, far from an exhaustive list, but provides some concrete examples of the ways in which Crenshaw's influence has permeated social psychology, and I would argue psychological science broadly. The recent popularization of intersectionality within academia has also led many to explicitly encourage and name the integration of critical theories and methods within psychology, including intersectionality. For instance, a core theme of the most recent Society for Personality and Social Psychology, or SPSP conference, was critical theories and methods. Still, many remain ignorant of intersectionality or fail to truly incorporate it within their research. And I'm here today to kind of ask the question, why might that be the case? Now, I would say happily we have arrived at the ordinary but fundamental aspect of my presentation today. Some people call this the meat and potatoes. That is, what are the particular obstacles academics might encounter when integrating intersectionality within psychological science? And by academics, today I'm going to speak specifically to the experiences of PhD students within the academy, which I'll explain a little bit further. So why do I focus on PhD students? Well, I believe graduate school for a lot of PhD students is regarded as a time to really shape one's craft and career. So you're gaining valuable expertise and experience to guide your research forward and subsequently influence your teaching and mentorship. So you're really starting to cultivate a sense of identity as an academic, and you're developing this large program of research. With that being said, I believe it is most relevant and useful to provide a strong grasp of critical theories and methods to PhD students to really ensure that these skills are successfully carried over into one's research and furthermore into the academy. So now thinking broader, kind of these mainstream streams of information or knowledge. While PhD students might be a critical entry point, PhD students are also typically deemed lower status or early career within the academy. I call this the academic food chain, if you will. And that means it's essential to address the specific challenges PhD students might face when integrating intersectionality. And while it may be obvious, it's worth noting that these challenges are also likely to differ at different stages of one's career. So again, I'll be speaking directly to the PhD experience, but I'm sure for audience members who are at maybe a postdoc or faculty role, these challenges might differ. So I made sure to refine our earlier title, if you noticed, from current challenges broadly to current challenges for PhD students. The question is perhaps rhetorical, but it might be valuable for you to consider on your own what challenges you might consider relevant to PhD students. You might even consider adding them to the Q&A later. So I'll stop here and pause for a moment while you think about the challenges unique to PhD students, ones that are critical for us to address. Hopefully you've thought of one or two, and perhaps I'll continue on. While you consider those, allow me to pose maybe a few of my own, whether this is based on personal experiences or just ones that I've simply were able to generate. So I believe at the individual level, some programs might not have adequate training or faculty that are really familiar with intersectionality, let alone how to incorporate it. I consider a lack of training or understanding a large problem and one with many roots. So for instance, inadequate training might be the result of an intentional silencing or simply a lack of interest among faculty. PhD students who possess significant racial or class privilege might be ignorant to oppressive power systems and satisfied by their current curriculum or training. While PhD students experiencing discrimination within their program or society at large may feel even less equipped or supported to really learn about or engage with intersectionality. So there might be a demand, but it's not being met. Alternatively, a student might be excited or willing to learn about it, but a lack of training or maybe statistical knowledge might leave them feeling insecure about really navigating its integration. I believe these are all reasonable possibilities, and perhaps you can think of more yourself. I'm adding another qualifier before I proceed. I want to note that I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who uses quantitative methodologies. And methodologically, the integration of an intersectional perspective into tangible quantitative research presents another set of unique challenges. In fact, that is frequently one of the largest concerns I hear among my peers. How would you quantify intersectionality? How would I analyze data with an intersectional lens? Like, what are the concrete research practices that I can use when I'm uploading a survey or experiment, for instance? Other common critiques or fears related to quantitative research specifically include otherizing participants, right? So maybe you combine marginalized groups as comparisons to a majority baseline, or you fear categorizing larger groups as monoliths. So you're losing that granularity and nuance that is so important. However, I would argue that these tactics are incompatible with intersectionality, right? So these tactics would only recreate rather than challenge existing systems of oppression or power, and again, are therefore incompatible with intersectionality. So there must be a better way. And if we have some time at the end, there are already existing some resources on how to integrate an intersectional perspective as you both think about, participant recruitment, but also actually analyzing your data, which I can talk a little bit more about later on. Speaking of power, I believe PhD students not only receive little education on critical theories or methods, but the study of critical theories and methods itself might be riskier for PhD students who are deemed lower status or constrained to the parameters of their institution, their career stage, etc. The application of intersectionality frequently challenges conventional academic norms and has the potential to adversely affect one's career or sense of belonging within the academy. Institutions might also be wary of incorporating curricula such as intersectionality because it directly challenges the status quo. Now, several factors contribute to this resistance, including scholarly competition, but also epistemic exclusion. So Isis Settles, I mentioned earlier, writes a lot about this, for instance. And so scholarship that engages with intersectionality may appear radical or even undesirable. And learning a new skill or methodology early in one's career can be costly, especially one that is unpopular or uncommon. Accompanied by conflicting incentives that limit PhD students' learning and engagement, such as publishing frequently, it's unsurprising that the integration of intersectionality within psychological science or the adoption of critical theories and methods among PhD students has remained sluggish. Yet intersectionality, on a more positive note, I believe, has tremendous benefits for advancing psychological science. And in particular, I want to discuss applications for open science. For instance, many researchers are beginning to invest in practices such as sharing data, tools, and knowledge, as well as collaborative networks. Of course, I imagine you share these values attending this talk. And one benefit of open science is an enhancement of collaboration between researchers, but also a creation of transparent and efficient research practices that increase the speed and efficacy of scientific dissemination, as well as enable access to content that is traditionally hidden behind paywalls. So I believe intersectionality can really advance equitable open science practices. And in recent years, open science has been hailed as a great equalizer in the wake of the internet and increased global connectivity. Yet inequities such as career advancement for scientists from high-income countries can worsen when open science is done incorrectly. Alternatively, I argue that intersectionality can make open science practices easier, more affordable, and more valuable. In particular, when intersectionality forces us to confront assumptions about power that are often left unattended within research. So for instance, people frequently consider work related to intersectionality as low quality science. I think getting to the root of why people may assume that to be true would really help broaden our research practices. And it also forces us to question who is qualified to produce science, or maybe why people consider what is considered publishable or not. The peer review process also frequently privileges white authors, especially authors from North America, thereby limiting the diversity of scholarship or authorship within our fields. So I believe an increasing need to develop transparent and open source solutions for publication, such as preprint servers, can reduce a lot of this systematic inequality and provide new channels for tackling imbalances of power that I think intersectionality intersectionality is tasked to really handle. Beyond the benefits to our science, I believe incorporating intersectionality within psychological science holds scientists accountable, right? So these rigorous science practices can help be integrated into the field. But I also think incorporating intersectionality within psychological science helps develop an important sense of social responsibility that sometimes I feel like academics might be out of touch with. And maybe again, it's just my activist background, but I really think social responsibility is a core tenet of being an academic. So making sure our science is sound helps highlight a broad set of experiences and raises voice to people that are frequently left out of or excluded from our research. So for instance, my colleague, who I will talk a little bit about later, has developed a substantial amount of scholarship that exists to promote intersectional clinical training, for instance, both to unpack privilege and promote critical consciousness, as well as reduce harm to clients and students. And as I mentioned earlier, we're both very mindful of centering Black women and girls in our goals of promoting intersectionality within psychological science, meaning our research practice and also our training. I believe a development of social responsibility will also allow us to consider the ethical implications of our research. For instance, self-identification as an intersectional scholar is becoming increasingly profitable. Intersectionality is then subjected to commodification or the dilution of its original history and origin. It no longer is about power or resistance, but becomes a vehicle for personal gain, or at worst, a sticker on a laptop, devoid of commitment or integrity. You see this a lot, for instance, in the organizational space. So the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're starting to see scholars stamp themselves as DEI experts, but they seem to be devoid of the actual practices or commitments that would happen on the ground to engage people, not only within the academy, but outside of it. And I think something that is so unique about our program here at the Graduate Center, so the Basic and Applied Social Psychology program, is we do both basic and applied research. So we're constantly thinking about policy applications or how our work can be integrated across context or settings. So within schools, within organizations. And in the academic and clinical settings, it's really important when you're trying to integrate intersectionality to really actually challenge those structures that oppress marginalized students, patients, and scholars, rather than just enjoying the fruits of calling yourself an intersectional scholar or scientist. I think back also to the Intersectionality Training Institute that I mentioned was founded by Dr. Lisa Boleg. A lot of her work for a while advanced critical understanding of HIV/AIDS prevention work, sexual health risk, for instance. And now she's really working with the Institute to implement a lot of the research she's learned throughout the years to actually advance, again, clinical settings or real world practices, which is, I think, an awesome application of how academics can talk to, not that academia isn't the real world, but can really talk to these concrete organizational practices, other people, etc. And that's a core tenet of the comprehensive, accessible, and intersectional science approach I mentioned earlier, so that collaboration across fields and disciplines. At the societal level, so panning out not just our science, but who we are as people and I guess the everyday world we live in. I believe that integrating intersectionality within psychological science will encourage our science to evolve. And this is particularly important in an increasingly diverse society. So I think a lot about the US and my research on interracial interactions, for instance. So we're becoming more racially diverse within the US, but diversity is can be a broad stroke of a lot of different identities we talked about earlier. So race, gender, class. When we think about extending our research beyond these homogeneous samples to consider history, context, identity, even when the study design is seemingly neutral or objective, it ensures that our analyses account for power. So the power that is so relevant to intersectionality. After all, our ability to represent society within our science is lacking. So this is not only limited to who we actually study. So you might often hear that psychology is weird, or that we tend to focus on English speakers, again, North American white samples largely. And also, so it's not just limited to who we study, but who we are as scientists. So for instance, white providers in the US are disproportionately represented compared to the general population. And I think solving imbalances of representation is greater than recruiting people to diversify the academy. Rather, it requires a commitment to addressing imbalances of power, which I believe intersectionality is tasked to handle. So I really want to drive home this point. Intersectionality is tasked to handle these imbalances of power that seem to be these like really difficult challenges we're facing as a science. So as psychological science, we think of the future of how our field will go. I'm thinking, well, hey, wouldn't it be great to advance our understanding of critical theories and methods, not just intersectionality? There's a broad band of critical theories and methods that I didn't touch on today, but I encourage you to think about and consider after this talk. And I imagine doing so would really help us address a lot of these imbalances of power I mentioned earlier. So for instance, PhD students not having the training needed to really integrate these things, and also addressing status and early career stage seems to be crucial. Taken together, I think I highlight a really distinct tension between an ideal of integrating intersectionality to advance psychological science. So I've told you about all these benefits, like how great our science could be theoretically. But then there's the actual reality of integrating intersectionality to advance psychological science, which remains sluggish in spite of its benefits. And this is really such a hard thing for me to, I guess, think about. There's all these benefits. It seems like the most cost-effective thing to do to integrate them, and yet intersectionality kind of remains at the margins, so pushed off into specialty journals. People don't really know a lot about it. They might have heard it here and there, or maybe even outside of an academic context. So again, to my experience, but it really raises the question, is a scientific ideal like integrating intersectionality possible? And my hope is that you leave this presentation with the belief that it is more than possible. In fact, it's increasingly desirable. And our neglect to integrate intersectionality remains what I consider a major challenge we must confront as psychologists if we seek to strengthen our science. But are we prepared to address the challenge? You know, I recently wrote an educator's corner for FORT, which I'll mention in my final slides, and maybe some of you are already familiar with. But I address some of these challenges we're grappling with, right? So our science isn't as diverse as it could be. We've studied a lot of majority group members, white people, men, high SES or high status groups. And this just has a lot of downstream consequences for the generalizability of our science, or maybe how robust and rigorous it could truly be. And to address that, I would probably say that a collaborative overhaul of our current institutional standards are in order. So it's not just a cultural shift. I think it will take a major shift in the academy and social psychology in particular to really value and uphold critical theories and methods as a standard and routine practice. But I see a lot of parallels with open science when it first came out, and how uncommon it was probably at first, and still I would argue is quite uncommon, to pre-register your studies, for instance. But imagine how cool it would be if you had, let's say, a pre-registration on the Open Science Framework that included a section on intersectionality. So it provided the actual resources, the papers I talked about, so the actual science practices that you can use for an intersectional lens, for instance, and then asked, hey, did you do these things? I think open science and intersectionality could really talk to each other in really beautiful ways. And again, like open science, become a standard and routine practice, or increasingly so. Finally, I will leave you with two important questions to ponder. So one, what would a psychological science that exposes PhD students to critical theories and methods look like? So we mentioned earlier some challenges, so a lack of understanding or training, as well as a lack of maybe status or power. So how would we actually expose PhD students to critical theories and methods? And finally, how might we equip students with the tools necessary to dismantle the systems of power intersectionality describes? So the racism, the sexism, the classism, all these isms that I would argue are debilitating our science. So how do we address those? I don't know. That's something we can talk about. But I want to thank you kindly for your time and attention, and to my collaborator, who I discussed a little bit earlier, Annalisa C. Burney. She's really been instrumental to developing this work. She has a clinical/counseling background and really helps me talk to ways in which social psychology could really be enhanced by some of the things that clinical and counseling psychology have already, I would argue, integrated pretty well. So intersectionality isn't really a new concept for her. I also want to thank FORT, which I talked a little bit briefly about, the framework for open and reproducible research training, which has really allowed me to develop this line of work in collaboration with their team. So working through some of the kinks and challenges that come with critical theories and methods. And of course, to Riot for inviting me. I really thank you for your time and look forward to your questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now.
Great. Thank you so much for the talk. This was very, very interesting and eye-opening for me. So let's dive into the questions. I can already see a published question in the Q&A, so I'm gonna read it out. Janice asks, as a PhD student, do you have suggestions on how to push against Monsignor collaborators who do not discuss power and focus on identities when working on projects related to intersectionality, especially as this gets conflated and is accepted and maybe easier accepted by reviewers?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and maybe speaks to some of the challenges I mentioned. So it sounds like when you're pushing against the senior collaborator, there's a power struggle or differential that's hard to really cultivate as a PhD student, right? So like, what do you do? I think it talks a little bit to those challenges, but also I think because intersectionality has been so slow to be incorporated, things like identity or power, I think for a lot of senior collaborators or faculty, they're not really thinking about these things. It's not really common to think about them. And again, if you have significant privileges within your own life, maybe you're not even thinking about them. So they do exist, but it's not a part of your science practices. Suggestions, how to push back. I think if you haven't already, it's worth noting, like, hey, have you considered the ways in which XYZ. I think some people sometimes need to be reminded, like I bring up some similar challenges in my examples. Like there is a true camp of people that I believe have no desire to learn about intersectionality. They might at the worst end or extreme be hostile to the incorporation of intersectionality within psychological science. So it's threatening, right? To think about power and identity, to think about how our science has failed to really capture people's experiences. And I'm not sure, I imagine those people aren't very sympathetic to my talk or your encouragement to discuss power and focus on identities. But I also think there is a much larger camp, right, that is just genuinely ignorant. So might have heard of intersectionality, not really sure what it means, or gets like this simplistic version, right? So it's about power, it's about identity. And they might just not know. And so the threat is not like, hey, I don't want to talk about power identity. It's just like, hey, I don't know how to do this, or I'm not really sure what this is. If that's the case, I think you should really encourage your collaborator to say like, hey, here are some resources, or like, let's talk a little bit about what an intersectional framework or perspective might look like on this project. I think it would be really important to integrate this. I want you to learn this with me. I think that could be really attractive. It could help strengthen your collaboration. I think by you being vulnerable, it facilitates a level of psychological richness to your relationship, especially if you already have a relatively positive collaboration happening. And I would also try to be clear in your education, like what intersectionality is, or to my earlier point, what it's not. So there are resources. I'd love to provide some. ISIS Settles, like I mentioned, in addition to some other collaborators, put out an article recently, What If Psychology Took Intersectionality Seriously? Pulling that up now so I can pop it in the
Perfect, thank you.
Q&A. And they follow up with an additional paper. So I'm gonna pop that in there and then you can read as you wish.
Perfect. Yeah, I was just gonna say if people have more questions, please keep posting them while we are gonna also post the articles.
And so that should be open access, the link. So the PDF is available. I think this is a great introductory read on some of the practices that you can start integrating. And it discusses some perspective shifts about intersectional thinking, especially, again, thinking about quantitative research practices and methods.
Yeah, that is very interesting. As a mostly quantitative researcher myself, I was wondering how it would look like when it comes to quantitative analysis to actually integrate this. And I think oftentimes, both at the stage of data collection and data analysis, mostly at data collection, sometimes, especially when working with big cohort studies, there's a tendency to try to stick with less variables, only the variables that are interesting. And oftentimes this is why then it becomes very limiting, because only certain people get to choose what kind of factors are going to investigate in these cohort studies. So yeah, how to actually be able to start thinking about different levels of intersectionality, how to integrate that at different stages in the scientific process, because I guess it can come at these different stages, both at data collection and data analysis, and how to approach it is yeah, it is very challenging, especially for a PhD student that is also starting the career.
Yeah, I would argue that like just learning stats and data as a PhD student alone, like at a very minimum level. So like an introductory stats course at the graduate level can already be intimidating. So to tack on, hey, well, like here are some other steps you can learn, especially when you're strapped for time. In the US, you also typically have like teaching requirements and other things. So there's just, again, the tension is like there are benefits, but I think we can only really fully enjoy those benefits if we tackle some of these challenges. So like if time is a concern, how do we adequately support students so that they do have the ability to say like, hey, I actually want to learn about this thing. Can I take a seminar? Or can I have funding to attend this workshop? Or there's services provided, for instance, by the Intersectionality Training Institute. So it'd be great if a program said, hey, we're going to have Dr. Lisa Boleg come and talk to us about some of the practices she's incorporated or learned during her time as a psychologist and as a scholar. I mean, she continues consistently to develop research practices, methods that organizations or even, again, clinical, I guess, practitioners can integrate. So it'd be great to have those resources available. And again, that's why I tip my hats off to our program here at the Grad Center with the specific basic and applied social psychology focus, is that we're constantly thinking about the application of our research, which I don't think a lot of graduate students generally are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. And so follow-up question, when it comes to quantitative methods again, and you're thinking of different facets of intersectionality, I guess different facets might be relevant more for different projects depending on what your research question is. So that also might be an extra challenge for a student that is trying to decide which of these facets do I value if I cannot incorporate all of them and the whole diversity of intersectionality into my single project. If I fail to incorporate some of them and prioritize others, is that an issue? And how do I choose? Is it from my own positionality as a researcher? Do I bring in who I am, or do I try to incorporate other people's view? So also drawing from qualitative research again, and the idea of like positionality, which we don't really talk about in more quantitative research practices.
Yeah.
In the moment when you start to making those choices, and like it's kind of a degree of freedom on how you decide to pick different levels of intersectionality and incorporate it in your analysis, you're also deciding what to prioritize among them as a researcher.
Yeah, that brings up a great point. I agree with your statement about how we don't discuss enough our positionality as scientists, right? So like the experiences, the identities that we bring to the table when we're studying the things that we do. And I think that is why, again, shameless plug, why I think speaking with the open science framework or, you know, resources like As Predicted and say like, hey, have you considered thinking about including something like that when people pre-register their studies, I think would be so cool. You know, like, are there any particular identities or experiences you want to discuss? Have you considered, and then just a drop down list, like history, context, what's your population, like, for instance, some of my research the last couple of years has been on COVID. It would be remiss to address how COVID has shaped a lot of these psychological processes, right? So thinking about a lot of my work focuses on the actual behaviors people will do to mitigate the spread or transmission of COVID. And COVID has shaped a lot about like how we interact with people, how we think of ourselves, right? So you have to address how this huge global global health crisis has shifted a lot of how we think about the world and how we engage with the world. But there's some other work I cite in the Fort Educational Corner, which maybe if I have time, I can drop in the chat. So it was discussing the grand challenges facing psychological science with insights from intersectionality and open science. The 4 grand challenges are actually what inform my science approach. So globalization and diversity, research integrity and applicability, collaboration, and then strengthening theory or holistic theory building. And in there, I talk about how a few concrete examples. So I have a colleague from my time at the University of Virginia who was looking at the number of lynching victims in Confederate states in the US South, and how race and social forces such as the Civil War contributed to a lot of the anti-Black racism that you see during Reconstruction in the US South, and paints this really beautiful, I would say, intersectional almost approach to the study of Confederate monuments, what they might mean for different people, and how they exclude directly Black Americans. And so you could see how a take like this could really be insightful for other fields and disciplines as well. So to speak to the collaboration, American politics, history, Africana studies. And in there as well is another colleague of mine, Jessie Stern. She went ahead and developed a new version of the ecological systems theory that actually centers Black girls. And there's a clip of that in the piece I wrote for Fort. And again, it's just strengthening and I guess broadening, diversifying who we're talking about, making sure our science is responsive to society broadly. And I wonder sometimes too if quantitative methods really limit the extent to which we're really able to speak about these things. So like identity, context, history, power, these are like some really, it's hard to quantify these things sometimes. And hey, I didn't get into it, but I think there's also probably a demand to have more mixed methods within psychology, especially social psychology. And it's something I've even started to realize on my work on interracial interactions, perceptions of biracial people. I feel like we've lost the value in really talking to people and understanding their perspectives directly. So things like focus groups, in-depth interviews, or actually bringing participants into the lab. So like COVID halted a lot of the traditional psychological experiments we run on campus, for instance. And I think getting back to the actual, putting the people back in psychology would really help advance our discipline. And I think the intersectionality can really do that, right? Because people are constantly confronted with power, these abstract systems like racism, sexism.
Yeah.
So
we have a final question from Leah. Hopefully I pronounce your name correctly, which says, thank you for your super interesting presentation. This may be a little technical for our discussion, but how do you deal with other kind of power, for instance, the one related to sample size, when trying to look at intersectionality in quantitative research?
Yeah, so I mentioned a big challenge for quant people is like sometimes we collapse categories, for instance, especially identity categories like race or gender. And this can really do our participants a disservice. So we're treating people as monoliths, like I mentioned earlier, rather than really seeking the granularity. I think the preprint is a good, again, point of intervention that we can use, because to your earlier point, Luisa, we can start to think about the actual specific questions or identities that we want to examine within our studies. So like they'll ask you, what's your research question? What particular variables are you looking at? If you start to add an intersectional lens to that, people can start thinking about those questions and also significantly addressing what you're talking about, like statistical power. So thinking about the actual sample size needed to figure out that variation among people, and also I think identifying what questions you actually want to address will help figure out what your sample size might be.
Great. So it is 4, and I don't think we have additional questions. So I want to thank you again. This was really, really interesting, eye-opening, and great presentation, also very clear. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for the presentation. You can find the resources on the chat for anyone that is interested in reading Annalisa's work and looking more into intersectionality and related topics. So unless Lorenza or Milan want to add anything, no? Then thanks again, and yeah, good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you so much.
Bye.